Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this very special breakfast meeting of ForoCompetencia. As you know, last Sunday we turned 20 years old, and we're celebrating this anniversary today. And at first, I thought that it was the best way to celebrate this anniversary was having a good discussion on the evolution of competition law in Latin America. And I think that Bill Kovacic is perhaps the reason why he was invited to give this talk, because he's someone who has followed very closely the evolution of competition law in Latin America over the years. And at the same time, he has the advantage of not being a Latin American, so he has the advantage of having some perspective on his analysis. Second, he has the record of miles traveled in order to get to a ForoCompetencia event. A few years ago, he traveled from London to Buenos Aires directly to the event, and then directly back to the airport to go back to Washington. And later I found out that he was not coming from London, but he was coming from Israel. So he did all that for a ForoCompetencia event. So that is a record very difficult to surpass, especially nowadays. And third, he has written a very interesting paper which I share with you, and he will be discussing this paper late now. So Bill doesn't need much introduction. He's well known for and a friend of most of us. He's a former chairman of the Fair Trade Commission. He's currently a non-executive director of the CMA. He's a professor of George Washington University and a visiting professor at King's College. So, Bill, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Julian. It's delightful to be part of this celebration, and we don't celebrate age for its own sake. I intend today to celebrate the Foro in talking about the development of competition law in Latin America, to celebrate the Foro for what it has contributed to that process. So my presentation is a mix of reflections on the larger region, but also on the important role that hubs that promote discussion and conversation are essential to progress in any individual jurisdiction. My main focus today is on policy implementation and how that process has unfolded, certainly over the past 30 years, and to identify some crucial ingredients of that process. My interest in this issue certainly goes back to my time at the US Federal Trade Commission. Going from an academic environment to see theory meet practice was quite jarring for me, even though I had been at the Federal Trade Commission as a very junior time in my career. And a good deal of what I saw was just how hard the match was. I compared it with my childhood fixation with sport to be the difference between watching a football match and actually playing it. And to imagine that you were in the stadium criticizing the players, telling them they could make better passes, they ought to score more goals, and imagine them stopping the match and pointing to you and saying, "Come down and join us." And when that moment came for me, I came to see how fast the match was, how rough it was, how difficult it was. And it underscored for me the importance of implementation, thinking about how you take policy aspirations and convert them into programs that work. This was not an entirely new insight for me. When I was an undergraduate a little while ago, a mere, let's say 50 plus years ago, one of the classic texts in political science had just been authored. This is Graham Allison's study of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Allison's main observation in closing his text was that we don't think hard enough about implementation. He said, if we want to achieve desired outcomes, we're going to have to think more about creating the path between the preferred solution and the actual performance of government. How do we travel the often treacherous distance between our grand ideas about what government and policy should do and its actual accomplishment in practice? And historically, I would say in our field, there's been a tendency to focus on the broad aspiration, the ultimate goal, but to spend less time thinking about how to get there. I want to draw upon an earlier example that frames this. It is now almost 60 years precisely since John Kennedy appeared before the US Congress and made this speech. He tells the Congress, by the end of the decade, we should commit ourselves to landing a man on the moon and, this was the key part, returning him safely to Earth. That is a round trip. At the time Kennedy made the speech, virtually none of the technical capabilities to do that job had been established. Now, the concept, the big idea, the physics of doing it was relatively straightforward. There was some fancy mathematics that went into doing it, but the basic idea in concept of what you had to do to send people to the moon and bring them back safely to Earth was not obscure. That physics was understandable. The engineering was really hard. That's the Apollo 11 getting off on its journey to the moon in 1969. All of the technical capabilities that sent Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins to the moon and landed Armstrong and Aldrin on the moon did not exist. Not the reliable semiconductors, not the propulsion systems, not the navigation, not the communications. That all had to be built. That was really hard. The engineering of going back and forth to the moon is very difficult. And I'd simply suggest that in our field, there has been a tendency to emphasize the physics of competition policy and less the implementation. That's changing in very healthy ways that bear directly upon the experience of competition authorities in Latin America. And it is a tribute to a number of observers. For example, the work of the international networks such as OECD, ICN, that more and more of their agenda is focusing on the question of implementation. But that's my core concern here. So I want to talk about what accounts for the favorable evolution of a system. And to focus on the Latin American context, I'm going to draw upon some examples from the larger world. And my focus on implementation today is to study how learning is vital to the process of improvement. Learning inside of an agency, across agencies, and across time is essential. And I do want to celebrate the contributions of the Foro to making that happen. Not only in Argentina, but I would suggest it has become a crucial hub for the development of policy throughout the continent and throughout Latin America. It is no accident that other jurisdictions that in some sense have deep-seated rivalries with Argentina, a little bit having to do with sport now and then, sometimes having to do with who's got the most exciting beverages and the best treatment of the dinner table. All of those issues, along with longstanding political tensions and disagreements. Nonetheless, if we stand back and look at the world, I can say with confidence that Foro is unique. You cannot find a similar mechanism throughout, certainly, the world of 100 new competition policy systems since 1990. And its distinctive accomplishment has been to provide a non-government mechanism designed to bring together the larger community of individuals, public officials, practitioners, academics, advocacy groups, into a conversation about competition policy. I just ask each of you who know the region much better than I do. As Julian said, I'm an outsider. But those of you who know it, imagine what your interactions in this field would have been like if the Foro did not exist. If for the last 20 years it had not been providing the substantive, intellectual, and human glue that holds together a competition policy system. And I want to celebrate in part how vital that type of contribution is to the development of a successful system. I'm giving you my views only. As Julian mentioned, I'm on the board at the CMA, but I'm going to draw upon some comparisons based on my time at the CMA about what makes agencies get better and what leaves them stalled in neutral or even puts them into reverse. Several resources I'm drawing upon. It was really with Julian's suggestion years ago that I started thinking about patterns and trends in the development of competition law in Latin America. That led to a larger collaboration with Marianela Lopez Galdos that expanded on those themes. And another volume that I draw upon heavily is a new contribution by our unsurpassed scholar in the field of international competition law, and that's David Gerber. That's his recent text, Competition Law and Antitrust, a Global Guide. If you trace David's work, as I have, going back to my time as a more junior person in the field, his formative work about the development of competition law in Europe, his subsequent work on competition law in a global context. There are superb scholars in this field. You know who they are. The remarkable Eleanor Fox, a newer generation of scholars like Michal Gal in Israel. These are truly superior scholars. Nobody's better than David, I think, in capturing what's going on. And what I have learned so much from him is the importance of looking at institutional foundations and considering what is it that makes a system work well. What is the essential machinery that makes a system work well? These are some of my main intellectual debts. One other source of observations comes from recent projects that I would call know-how projects, in the sense that they seek to accumulate and collect the kind of knowledge that does not show up in books, but bears upon how one does the job. With Concurrence, I've been doing a series of interviews of competition agency officials who have served in their posts for a long period of time or have left those posts. We've done a first round of about 25, which we intend to publish with transcripts and an interpretive essay. Many of the interviews are on the Concurrence website. But what we've asked different leaders is, what do you know today that you wish you had known on day one? What have you learned about doing this job that bears upon not simply the success of your agency, but might illuminate the work of others? And here again, the idea is to pick up and collect knowledge that might seep into the ground if we didn't try to sit down with these folks and talk to them about it. With Marianela, we're doing a benchmarking project at GW that tries to look at all of the world's national competition authorities and compare them according to major characteristics. And just one of a number of initiatives, one carried out by the OECD and CRES, the academic hub that Yanis Katsoulakis has created in Greece, a course called CALEP, which is designed to train and teach agency officials, especially to try to catch them early in the cycle of their tenure, to say, here are things to think about how to do the job, things that can make your life better, things, if not attended to, will assuredly make your life worse. These are all sources of observation. But again, I'd say a larger theme for all of our agencies, and I would say something that has made the best of the Latin American agencies better is their ability to learn, reflect on the past, and incorporate the lessons of past experience into the development of the program going ahead. General observations based on what I think we've learned to this point, what we've learned from now in going back to the creation of the original system in Colombia over a half century ago, through the development of new regimes in the 1990s, in particular into the 2000s. What are some general observations we can give about the development of a system? The first is that successful systems have a combination of ambition and realism. The ambition consists of saying we are going to the moon. We are going to embed in our national system a regime of new policy oversight that in many respects had no antecedent in our system. That's very hard to do no matter where you are. And we're going to seek to do that. That's the ambition. But also the realism of understanding what it takes to do that. And a basic observation that Marianella and I individually made 5 years ago or so was that when you look at all systems in the region, in a sense, there's an initial testing period of about 20 to 25 years before you can start to draw conclusions about how it's doing. Why do you need 20 or 25 years? It takes that long to build the intellectual infrastructure, to develop the administrative mechanisms and procedures for the new agency, to test its authority before the courts, to give the courts a measure of comfort with the new regime, to see how the agency responds to political shocks. Massive adjustments that come about as a result of economic disarray. For example, the kind that we've experienced over the last 18 months. In a way to liken the agency and the system to a boxer. And a key test for a professional boxer is how you respond after you have taken a brutal punch. Does it lay you on your back? And the last thing you hear is the referee mentioning the number 10 and it's over? Or are you able to recover and continue to perform even though you have suffered a very destabilizing blow? You don't know that in a regime for 20 to 25 years. What happens when there's a regime change, new leadership? How does it respond to these shocks? I guess in the modern vocabulary, we would say, how resilient is it? You don't know that for 20 to 25 years. And as we go through the list of things that a new system has to do, it gives us a sense of realism about how long it's going to take. To use another aviation example, you need both of these. That's almost a schizophrenic message. You need the ambition, but you need the realism. Charles Lindbergh, in the late spring of 1927, is standing next to his little single-engine airplane on an airfield in Queens, New York City. It's a rainy day. The field is soggy. He has not slept for 48 hours. And the question is, do I get in that plane and try to go to Paris? He had been very realistic in acknowledging what he was confronting. He didn't take a radio. He said, too heavy. I'm going to use a chart. I'm going to use a compass. And I'm going to use dead reckoning to get to Europe. And I hope get to Paris. He calculated how much fuel he needed. He was very realistic about the obstacles. But after looking at all the reasons that he might fail, wet field, hard to get off the ground, electric power lines at the end of the field that might catch his wheels as he tried to take his very heavy fuel-laden plane up off the ground, he did not say, I'm going back to sleep. He said, I'm going to Paris. So this mix of both ambition and realism, but the realism I'd say is very important to understand what one should expect and how quickly. And yes, a further footnote about that is that there is no system on the planet that is impervious to major subsequent shocks that puts it on the back foot and forces it to reassess what it will do and how it will do this. That is a basic question of resilience and adaptability over time. In short, one can take nothing for granted. And I would say as a footnote to look at the experience in the United States, if you go back 5 years and you ask yourself, will a second-year law student at Yale University, she's no ordinary student, she has been a journalist doing research, but will a second-year law student at Yale Law School in 2016 at the age of 32, become the chairman of the Federal Trade Commission in 2021, if you'd gone to the betting shop of your choice, they would not have taken your bet, because they would have said a wager has to be faintly realistic in order for us to take your money. We're in the business of taking your money, but we can't do it. Completely unforeseen development in policy, which by itself is worth the study of political scientists for years to come. The second is the good agencies. I've listed several of them here. It's not an exclusive list, and Julio is not going to put my back to the wall to give you a specific ranking, a seeding of the agencies. When I go to talk to any agency, I tell all of them they're in the top 10. Every agency in the world. So in my experience around the world, there are about 95 to 100 agencies in the top 10. And I usually am able to get out of town before someone really pushes me to define what I mean. But I simply give you some of the exemplars these are agencies that I would suggest have ascended to a position of prominence and influence globally. You cannot talk about the global competition regime, for example, without talking about Brazil, which, if I had to put one at the top of the ladder, not simply because of longevity, but because of significance, size, impact, I don't know how many of you would criticize me bitterly if I said, in some general sense, Brazil is the leader in the region. Its lead is not insurmountable. It is not inevitable. But the others I have put here, Chile and Mexico, all illustrate how the successful agencies have had a gradual process of ascent and step by step have improved over time. And that gradual process of improvement has been an important source of stability and effectiveness. Take the last two of the LATAM examples on my list, Chile and Mexico. I go back to a remarkable meeting that took place in 1996 in Lima in August. Beatriz Boza convened a meeting of Latin American officials and a few outsiders like me to celebrate the 5th anniversary of Indicopy, and to have a seminar that is doing in part what I'm talking about today, which is looking back a bit to decide where we're going. If you looked in that room and you said, what do you think now of the status of the Chilean Competition Authority or the Mexican Competition Authority? A proper answer would have been interesting, good officials, but, and what would follow the but? Nascent organizations with relatively weak powers, limited independent autonomous capacity to make policy. And Mexico in particular was a weak agency with good leadership, but a weak agency. Where is Mexico now? That is, look at the enhancement of Mexico's power step by step, so that it ends up in the modern era to be in the Constitution, side by side with the central bank as having constitutional status and protection. That did not happen overnight. That was a slow growth. And I'd say when we look at the life cycle and development of the Chilean system, we see a similar progression, steady development of capacity, skills, authority, power, so that we look at Chile now, and Chile, in many respects, I'd say, is a wonderful example of how you build a good system. I will say I do tell authorities around the world, if you want to study how to do it, study these examples. Most informative, how they did it, what they did, but those have featured a gradual incremental addition to authority, capability, and power, and it didn't happen overnight. But significantly, if you had filled out the report card for any of these after 5 years, you'd say, interesting, but what have they done? What have they accomplished? 10 years? Today, I think we look at all three and others. I have other favorites I like too, but if we look at these three, we say these are significant, substantial authorities, not just in Latin America. They have a voice that resonates globally. And in so many ways have been leaders, not just in their own hemisphere. Those other countries to the north in the hemisphere, there's a big one. There are two big ones in landmass. There's one of the fairly big population, but influential in their innovation and their demonstration of how to build good regimes. Gradual, steady, progressive ascent, built in many ways on significant investments in building the institutional foundations, paying attention to engineering, not just having an understanding of physics. I'm going to point to one ingredient throughout these systems in Latin America, and I think it's true elsewhere, the ingredient that makes you better over time. If you look at all of the literature on management that deals with successful institutions, what do? They learn. And there's a very virtuous life cycle that consists of experimentation, a willingness to fail, a recognition that failure is a necessary step on the path to success. But second, a reflection on that experience, continuous, and refinements based on what you've learned. This is a continuous process of learning and growth. And it only works if you're paying close attention to what you have done. That close examination involves an unsentimental, absolutely serious assessment of past work, not a gauzy evaluation based on what you hope you'd done, but what you actually did, realizing that nobody gets it right all the time, and then feeding that back into what you do next. That's the virtuous cycle of learning. But if you are not learning from what you've just done as a way of looking ahead, you're not going to progress, or you're not going to go in the right direction. You can't even, speeding up doesn't help. If you don't know where you're going faster does not necessarily help you out. Imagine being in the city and saying, I've got to get to the train station. I've got to go there. I don't know where it is, but I really have to speed up. That's not a formula for catching your train necessarily. There are three kinds of learning that I want to talk about some, both within individual systems, that's at the individual jurisdictional level, across systems, crucially, vital, something that's happening in the continent, something that's been so valuable is learning across systems, taking the experience of individual regimes and pooling that experience as a way of going ahead. If I had to identify one thing that will continue to promote the ascent of competition policy and its implementation effectively throughout the Latin American region, it is the deeper cooperation across systems that makes each of them smarter about what to do. And learning has to happen across periods of time. I'll say more about what I mean by that, which is, especially when you have a regime change, you have to make an honest, generous assessment of what predecessors did and take that on going ahead as a way of learning. You cannot assume that you're starting all over from scratch. You have to learn from what happened. And even if you are not fond of the political leadership from the previous regime, for whatever reason, it's a devastating mistake not to learn in a discriminating way, to discern good things that happened and take them on. Here are some recurring issues that deal with learning. The first is the construction of an intellectual infrastructure. Competition policy, as you know, rides upon a system of ideas about economics, about law, about history, about political science. No successful system emerges without a substantial indigenous intellectual infrastructure. And that means going country by country and asking, where are the intellectual hubs? And clearly they exist. Take the example of Peru, which was not on my list before. Peru has a superb collection of universities that now teach courses in competition law and competition economics. A very promising basis for the future of Peru's system is the existence of this infrastructure. And I would suggest it gets better all the time. If you go back again to Beatrice Bose's convention in 1996, the universities existed, but not the curriculum, not the instructors who made competition law a key ingredient of the curriculum, not the texts. The wonderful volume authored by Boulard and Faya on competition law and economics. These did not exist at the time. So a key question for any single jurisdiction is, how's the infrastructure? Do we have the network of universities and think tanks that are integrated into what the competition agency does? I would say the systems that have progressed have done that kind of integration. You know, another example, why has Brazil become so accomplished? Because they've got that infrastructure. Indeed, you even see the movement of academics into CAGE, into the related competition policy agencies and back out. A second key question is, how does the agency perform in the face of a regime change? We all have them. Political leadership, incumbents are displaced by new political leadership. It is rarely the case that political campaigns to seek office are polite events. And what tends to happen is that the contender for office, the outsider trying to get in, depicts the incumbent as being a catastrophe. When's the last time you saw a candidate for high office to be head of state say, my opponents, the incumbents, are really doing a lot of good things. Wow, really good things. Nice job. I have some refinements that I think are important, but I want to start by thanking them for all the good things they've done for our country. But I can take us farther, and that's why you should vote for me. Maybe it happens now and then. I know that Halley's Comet comes by roughly every 9 decades. It does. I don't see it very much in the global landscape today. The status quo is often depicted as a leper colony, and here comes the great healer to save it. A basic question for a competition agency and competition system, does that attitude seep into changes in leadership? Does new leadership come in and say, this was a catastrophe, I got here just in time to save it, and I'm the person to do it? I compare experience in the United Kingdom with the United States. Now, in the United Kingdom, there's some of these tendencies, but at the CMA, I have been struck at how rarely you see that attitude present in the agency, even in the face of regime change. There is a sense that we are learning all the time, and that learning is going to make us better in the future. In the United States, by contrast, I have lived through, as an FTC official, 2 brutal regime changes, and I've watched others. And there is a horrible tendency for new management to come in by saying, this place is a disaster and I've got to fix it. Here's a question for each of our systems, certainly in Latin America. How often do new leaders consult their predecessors? And how frequently do they do that? That's one test. Even if you don't particularly like them, do you sit down with them and say, tell me about how to do this job? For the sake of the country, for the sake of the agency, what can I do better? How often do you have that conversation with your predecessor? Do you ever give a speech in which you say, of course I have my own ideas. Those can be a source of vitality. But do you ever give a speech and say, by the way, I'm grateful to my predecessors for putting me in a position to succeed in key respects? And last, when you have a change of regime, is there a wholesale tendency to chase out the people who were associated with the predecessor leadership? Run them out of the agency and act as though anything that took place before was bankrupt. This, of course, is a terrible pathology. And a system that treats the change in regime as an individual event, this is my 100-meter dash, as opposed to a relay, is not going to learn very fast. Indeed, if there's nothing to learn from, why should I try? The essence for those of you who watch athletics, who watch track and field, know that a key ingredient of the relay is the exchange of the baton. That is frequently the basis on which teams prevail or lose. How smoothly the baton is passed. You can't imagine a relay team where the person ending their leg throws the baton down on the ground and looks at the next runner and says, "I defy you to pick it up." That never happens. Or that the next person in the leg chooses to throw the baton down and say, "Now I'm going to pick it up and use my own baton." That doesn't happen. Does leadership see its role as being a member of a relay race where success is the product of collective achievement, not individual accomplishment? A third key element of recurring issue is historical awareness. This is a David Gerber insight that goes back to David's wonderful first book on Europe. You start by understanding the context in which the system involved. Is the agency aware of what its original goals were intended to be? Does the agency have a historical sense of the formative influences that have changed the way the system operates? I'm not suggesting that each agency needs to have a professional historian on staff, but I'd say if you do not have that kind of memory, either in-house or a memory that you draw upon by going to your intellectual infrastructure partners in universities, you are traveling without a good awareness of how you make your agency better. Knowing the context and knowing the evolution of the system in a clear-headed way is vital to deciding what to do next. In part, it's knowing, for example, that your predecessors in the system decided to swim across a river. What did they discover? The river was full of crocodiles. Now, it's your turn to cross the river. Do you want to swim or do you want to build a boat? Your choice. If you know that there are crocodiles, that's a good reason to build a boat. And to know that that river is hazardous. And I better get a boat, and a good one if I'm going to cross the river, or maybe even to build a bridge. Good internal data sets. It's surprising how relatively few agencies have a clear-headed idea of what they've done over time. Changes in trends and the kinds of cases they've developed. What cases were they? Again, here I think the agencies that have progressed more effectively in the region maintain this kind of internal information base. And they look at it over time and they can explain and interpret why the mix of matters have changed over time. As you know, I'm not a big fan of measuring effectiveness just by activity. I'm much more interested in outcomes rather than inputs. I do want to know what the inputs have been, though. And a key question for an agency is, going back to the beginning of the agency, can you identify how the mix of activity has changed over time and explain why that happened? Third, historical awareness element. Do you build what you have learned from past experience into the formulation of strategy and the setting of priorities? In order to build it in, you have to have a system for setting strategy and selecting priorities. Another good measure for every agency is how clearly every year does it spell out to the larger public what it means to do and how it means to go about doing it. And then comes back at the end of the period and asks, how are we doing? When I look at the CMA, I regard the CMA as having the world's state-of-the-art framework for doing both of these things. They involve public consultation. They involve a very deliberate and thoughtful process internally of deciding every year on a regular basis, what should we be doing? That's the focal point of the board meetings every month. A large part of the board meetings consists of saying, what are we trying to accomplish and are we using the right tools to do it? And last part of historical awareness is evaluation. And again, I think if we look at the agencies that have grown and progressed, what are they doing in the region? They are spending time asking how our previous initiatives turned out. What happened? And in a simple way, comparing our assumptions at the beginning to actual experience going ahead. And I think when you go nation by nation, this is happening in the context of peer reviews carried out or encouraged by, say, UNCTAD or OECD, regional discussions in which agencies discuss their cases with each other. But that conscious element of evaluation is crucial to the ascent. Just a couple of other important elements of that relate to learning. What I'm going to call conversations. For your agency, do you have a mechanism for gathering views and observations about what you should be doing from the larger constellation of constituencies outside your own walls? How do you talk to your bar? How do you talk to academics? How do you talk to advocacy groups? Do you have a mechanism that engages you regularly in discussions with them? And ideally in a context that involves a constructive discussion of what you've done and what you might do differently in the future. It is not helpful to have a forum in which people shout at each other, and after a minute go directly to calling names, and then another minute later turning the name calling into a desperate exercise, an exchange of insults. That's not constructive. We've all been in those debates. Those don't work very well, and your instinct when you hear it is to say, check please, I'd like to go. Although I will admit as an academic, it is entertaining to watch those when you are not part of them. It's great entertainment, but not ultimately very productive. Why is the foro important? It's provided that. It's not the only way to do it. But I think when Julian and his colleagues convened the first one 20 years ago, they said, we need a setting where we're going to have a conversation that involves the performance of the system. If you are a public official, you do not take what the private sector has to say as the truth of God. You do not. They are getting paid by clients who want specific outcomes. But if a member of your bar says, I've watched your agency, I talked to your people, I think the wing is going to fall off of your airplane. I see a hairline crack, a fracture, which over time is going to make the wing come off the plane in flight. That's an observation that you should take seriously and go look at the wing. Do your own x-rays, take a look. You have to listen. In many instances, if you create an environment in which the conversation can take place in a constructive way, you can obtain that feedback from academics as well, from advocacy groups, but you need a forum in which they can talk. And often it might not be a forum that has a room full of 400 people. My experience is that when you put enforcement officials on a podium in front of 400 people, they quickly revert to the party line. They give you a book report about everything they've done. They begin by saying, we've been very busy. They give you the book report. The moderator says, ooh, that's fascinating. If I were in the audience, I would want to jump up and say, I don't care if you've been very busy. Have you been very productive? I had an athletic coach once who admonished me by saying, activity is not the same thing as accomplishment. So don't tell me how much you practice. Tell me how good you've become. That's what I want to know. A giant group may not be good for that. A smaller group, yes. Then you can have that conversation. The conversation between the agency and the courts. I think the experience in Chile is so important for the rest of the global community because a core issue globally is how does the agency talk to the courts that oversee it? To make sure the courts understand the constraints that the agency faces so that the agency understands what's important to the courts. I would say the development of the relationship between Fiscalia and the tribunal is a healthy one in this respect. The tribunal is not uncritical, but it is sympathetic to the larger aims of the system. And this is a conversation and discussion whose content and form is crucial to the global community of competition agencies. How does the agency interact with its courts? Latin America, in key respects, is telling us how to do that. And the Chilean experience is worth studying in that respect in a very detailed way. The third conversation is, how do you talk with your Congress, with the Prime Minister, with ministers of agencies? How do you define that relationship so that you are close enough to the political process that you can be effective, but not so far removed, not so far removed that you get frozen out, but not so close to the sun that you are like Mercury? It's no help to say every day on Mercury is a day in the sun, but it's very warm and you get burned to a crisp. And last, do you engage outsiders in that conversation? Critics on the outside who say, I think you're getting it wrong, maybe fundamentally wrong. This is what's happening in the United States. The outsiders who were dismissed were confronting an establishment, an antitrust establishment that thought, we have a lasting, immutable set of goals that focus on consumer interests. The other social policy dimensions are for someone else to handle. This is what we do. They did not see the upheaval that has now engulfed them coming. And if you don't talk to the outsiders, they will find a way to bypass the establishment. They will not assault the fortress head on. They'll bypass it. And what we've seen in recent experience in the US is that that's a strategy that can work. In some ways, it's working right now. A couple of closing thoughts on the importance of the comparative dimension. Agencies should engage in cooperation with their peers outside the country. I hesitated to say this because it is such a cliche. It's a slogan. And if you ask agencies, and I was one of them, do you cooperate with your counterparts? Oh, yes, we cooperate all the time. Cooperation is really important. I had that speech down pretty well all the time. What's the cooperation that counts? The cooperation that matters is to sit down and say, what the hell is actually going on? What are you doing? What are you doing that's working? What are you doing that's not working? In this case, what are you relying on? Show me your cards. Don't sit there at the poker table with your cards in front of you saying, I've got really good cards. Show me your cards. Put them on the table face up so I can understand why we're coming to a different result, why we have a different assessment. Let's ask questions about the methodology, realizing that the common cause is to get a better global result. That's what we're trying to do. But also, I want to learn. Do you want to learn in isolation? I look back at experience with sport too. I don't insist that anyone spend a life obsessed with sport. I wish I could get some of my random access memory and hard drive back in my head because it remembers play-by-play sporting matches, but I can't remember the name of cases anymore. But I remember the sport. I wish I had that back. It's hard to fix. But what I do think you see in sport is the learning that takes place between teams, the identification of global techniques, tactics. They get better over time. Agencies can learn so much from each other. And I think Latin agencies have led the way, showing that you can do that on a regional basis, in some ways better than you can in the giant room at the large international gatherings. The Latin agencies have done that to a significant extent. COVID, I think, is going to have a favorable byproduct. What has COVID taught agencies? My God, this mechanism, this screen can be pretty effective. You don't have to wait until you see your counterparts face to face at a wonderful gathering in BA, in Santiago, in Rio, yeah, even Brasilia, Mexico City, Lima. You don't have to wait until you have that meeting. You can engage daily if you want to this way. And another thing COVID did was to create an urgency to share information honestly, because the crisis was so desperate. You know, if your ship is suddenly listing because there's a big hole beneath the waterline, and if you don't fix the hole, you're going to sink. Suddenly, you're welcome to suggestions about how to stay afloat. Instead of saying, no, we're doing pretty well. Yes, the deck is tilting, but it really gives us a better look at the sea. No, how do I fix it? How do I stay afloat? I think agencies started sharing information about how to stay afloat and indeed how to do better in the future. And COVID inspired that. I've seen that at the CMA. I've seen it in the collaboration involving the UK, Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and Australia. I've seen the way in which they're going beyond the pleasantries of discussions, beyond the discussion of the individual case, to talk in more detail about how to do better as a group. That is still a frontier for improvement in the region and elsewhere. If you imagine the production possibilities frontier, we are still a dot inside of it. And that kind of deeper cooperation makes you smarter about technique, about the selection of cases, prioritization, to have an honest conversation about what's working and what doesn't. Requires trust, requires building trust. But it's unmistakable to me that when you look at the relationship among the Latin agencies, are they learning a lot from each other? No doubt about it. And they're using what might be called big competition policy data. What's big data? Big data involves data on trends and activity, on funding levels over time, personnel levels and the quality of personnel. For merger review, how much does a merger review cost? Yeah, mergers are different. There are hard ones, there are easier ones, but let's take the hard ones. How much does it cost? How much in terms of hours, expenses for consultants? How much? How many agencies know that for themselves in doing their own budgets? How many of them know over time how the quality of their personnel has risen or fallen? They try to measure that. How many of them pool results on evaluation and learn from the past cases? How many of them have formed an idea about how best to implement? The CMA 5 years ago started creating a data team to try and do these things better. And the quants, the data scientists who are doing this work, they're making the CMA a much better and more effective institution. They have over 40 people now doing analytics. They are doing as an agency what private companies now say they have to do all the time: mine data, collect data. Competition agencies have to do the same thing as a way of getting better. And yes, the good ones draw on academic hubs, university partners, and I see throughout the continent good relationships being built. But importantly, education centers for public officials. This could be an initiative for the region, to have a counterpart for the Australian and New Zealand School of Government, CALEP, which is the interesting initiative with OECD and CRESS. Imagine a center on the continent or a sub-part of that continent that focuses on how to be a good competition agency official, with presentations by previous officials saying, I'm going to tell you in this room how I did the job and what you can learn about doing the job better. That requires a willingness to listen to these earlier officials who gained experience and knowledge from a single unique source, and that's doing the job, not reading a book. So the ascent requires ambition, yes, to take on the process of the substance of the job, but also realism about what it takes to do the job well. And I'd simply say that a crucial foundation for doing this job well is to learn from the past, to learn from current experience, to identify the positive foundations for policy development and to build upon them, and to reinforce the virtuous cycle: experiment, testing, assessment, and refinement. Agencies and nations that do that, notwithstanding great shocks to their system, they do that well over time. That's how you build a great agency in Latin America and yes, elsewhere. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Bill. Now, well, we have many of those engineers who have helped build the different regimes that you mentioned in your presentation, present in the call now. So, in fact, two of them have already raised their hand, and I'll give the floor to Felipe first.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you, Julian. Bill, you have always been a source of inspiration to a global antitrust community, and especially to Latin America. And currently, a political effervescence is perceived in competition matters. We have the digital economy, new regulations are on the way, major changes in merger and monopolization, the complexity of globalization, and the emergence of China. So my question is, what advice would you give to a public servant and a private practitioner from Latin America to survive in these times? What psychological and character traits are we going to need? How much political sensitivity should we have? What relevant agencies should we be watching closely?
Yeah, I think more and more I acknowledge that the job of being the good public servant or being the good advisor to companies more and more requires the skills of the greatest of the midfielders who ever stepped onto a football pitch. What's a characteristic of the great midfielder? 360-degree vision. You can see the entire pitch. You not simply see the defender immediately before you, but you see the strikers 30 meters down the field. And you're not thinking of just taking the opponent who's right in front of you. You want to put the ball on the foot of the striker who's moving toward the box. You see the entire field. Indeed, notice how many times a great midfielder, when someone approaches them from the side or the back, just suddenly gets out of the way and moves abruptly. They know they're there. They have intuition about the entire context. Where do you get that intuition? I think more and more you have to draw upon the larger skills of this intellectual infrastructure that has some insights about this. The technologists, those who specialize in global trade and change. You have to make a conscious decision to renew your intellectual capital by bringing them into the discussion and taking advantage of what they know, and making investments and becoming smarter in those policy dimensions in the future. I think it is also here again important that agencies and indeed practitioners talk to each other about this fast changing environment. Once this contest begins, you do not have time to build an aircraft carrier. That takes 7 years. For the contest you have now, you have to have the resources and the capabilities you have right now and to bring them to bear. But there will be future contests and you have to invest in order to address those. Who do I think is doing a good job of trying to cope with this environment? I'm going to give you a hometown call and say it's the CMA. And of course, they're doing it because I'm there. I like them because I'm there. That's why, of course. Why would they not be successful? Of course. No, I'm along for the ride. But what are they doing well? They have invested over the last 5 years or so in building the knowledge base to anticipate these changes, to reconfiguring their agency internally to take them on, to look for new authority and new tools. The result of responding to the report that Jason Furman, Philip Marsden, Amelia Fletcher, Professor Boyle put together on the vision for the future. They are continuously adapting their framework to create new tools to look to the future. So if I had to study one agency that I really like for creating a framework for dealing with this, it's the CMA. That's the one that I like best. But I would say what is still missing in many respects is you now have several streams of policymaking, the DMA in Europe, the Digital Markets Unit in the UK, major developments in Australia, in China, nascent developments in the United States, And you step back and ask, are these people talking to each other? These are different standard setting organizations that are setting standard, pouring concrete that will affect the whole globe. Are they talking to each other on a regular basis? There, I would say not enough and not fast enough. This medium makes it possible to do that. I think they're understanding that you have to use this, even if you're looking at these pixels to try to do the job, you have to do that to be quicker and to be smarter. But if I were thinking about the conversation I would have among agencies and in a context like the Foro, the conversation with the larger constituencies, Felipe, I would be posing this question every minute I was in that meeting. Because it's not going to get any easier, is it?
Great. Esteban, you're next.
Esteban, hello. Great to see you.
Hello. Thank you, Bill. Great to see you. Happy birthday to ForoCompetencia. It's an honor to be part of this forum. Maybe my question is in part responded with this example of CMA, but my point or my comment and question is about, competition policies now in the middle of a debate about their if it is relevant, meaningful, and provide the timely tools to deal with actual market economy, maybe our digital economy. So I want to know, what do you think about this debate between regulation and competition tools, and how we in Latin America will deal with this new investment? You told us about the investment CMA made. We have less resources. We have limited resources. And we are in the middle of kind of questions about market economy and the political instability and waves of change. So in this complex context, what do you think competition policy tools will, which role the competition policy will have, and how in Latin America we have to approach to this?
Yeah, these are, Esteban, as Felipe did, you're asking questions which, when they are posed in the classroom, the instructor says, we'll get to that later. Or what do you think? I mean, these are the high graduate level exam questions that are in a sense justify a good answer. But I will suggest some ways of creeping up on good answers here. I would say one of the tools that becomes increasingly important is what we have come to call advocacy, and by that I mean the use of soft policy tools to be part of the conversation and the discussion. And what do we say in that conversation or discussion? We try to remind policymakers of what we know about the larger context. My view is that when you look at the competition agencies, and this is certainly true in the continent, they are among the best repositories of knowledge about the economy in their jurisdictions that exist in the whole country. They have the better intuition based on running cases, doing studies. They understand the microeconomic policy environment, and in many instances, they have an understanding of how macroeconomic policy has shaped competition, growth, innovation inside the country. So one basis on which they can speak to the benefits of a competitive process and about competition policy approaches is to say, we're not talking in the abstract. We're not here simply saying competition is good. We're saying it produces the following outcomes. It has affected our economy in the following ways. Now, can a nation decide to walk away from competition? Of course it can. But before you take that walk, we want to give you the benefit of what we have learned about how the economy is functioning and how pro-competitive policies are useful. For example, in the field of public procurement, look at how governments are poised now to spend countless sums and run it through the procurement process. One thing an agency can say is, we have some ideas about how you can get better results. You don't have to listen to us, but if you don't listen to us, there's going to be a lot of seepage and you will not get the full benefit of those expenditures. So I think one priority for agencies is to say, how do I become part of that discussion? And that is in the role of advocacy, and to marshal all of the experience that says, we're going to give you concrete, specific examples of how a pro-competition approach can make us all better off. I think repeating that, bringing that to bear on policymaking discussions is a crucial function. Related to that, as we pick cases and as we do cases, how do we link those cases to the larger sense of social benefit and advantage? And on the tough issue of how you deal with digital, this is where I think a collaborative approach becomes essential. The individual agencies in the region cannot fund a large R&D program to study these developments. Collectively, I think they can support this. They can do common studies. They can work with academic partners throughout the region to do this kind of work and engage in regular consultations with them and with the larger community about what's taking place. So that element of engagement and discussion, I think, becomes very important in this area. But it is also where the jurisdictions that have the resources to invest in the big cases, the big regulatory frameworks, the big policy interventions, have an obligation to share what they're learning with everybody else. And to sit down, again, as part of a collaboration and say, this is what we're seeing. By the way, if you gave them all truth serum and you said, do all of you have supreme confidence that what you're doing is going to make it better? Do you? I think the honest answer would be no. No, we don't. We are in the experimental phase. If you listen to the speeches from the big agencies with a lot of money, the discussions I have in Europe is we have to try things. I saw Andreas Munt in a presentation yesterday on European Competition Day say we have to move fast. We have to experiment. We have to try things. Speed is crucial. And the question in the background is, speed's crucial. Do you know where you're going? Do you? So you're going faster. You got to catch the train. Do you know where the train station is? Do you know where you're going? I think his answer would have been, yes, we have an intuition about that. But even there's a great deal of uncertainty about what to do and how to do it. But I think an honest conversation about the uncertainties and how you resolve them is also part of the solution.
Great.
Thank you.
Federico?
Thank you, Julian. Hi, Bill.
Federico, how are you?
Very well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
On my side.
Thank you. Let me ask you something. You were talking about intellectual infrastructure. I think this shall be one of the keys, the academic hubs, as you said. However, in countries like ours, like Argentina, it's somewhat difficult to create this intellectual structure. As you know, Bill, I've been working in antitrust compliance issues for years now. I'm trying to take these issues to universities. However, most of the times in Argentina, we can get 2 hours of a 6 months course, but a full 6 months course sounds somewhat impossible, as you won't ever gather enough students, as they don't even know about the existence of antitrust laws. Now, building that intellectual structure, you said, for building that structure, one of the obstacles to achieve these objectives shall be the deterrence, and how to build this structure, how to create certain competition culture along the citizenship when enforcement is not as as expected, maybe like it happens in Argentina?
I acknowledge the imperviousness of universities to change. If we talk about adroitness, flexibility, adaptability, and learning, those are not characteristics that I ordinarily associate with university structures or long-established academics. They don't try to learn because they think they know it all, not realizing that it's what you learn after you know it all that really counts. So this is a serious barrier. I think part of the success involves creating novel institutions or going to existing institutions and within the framework in which they operate to do something new. It involves a conscious search for a policy entrepreneur, someone more junior in their career who's willing to do something differently, maybe as an adjunct to their university, maybe as a collective enterprise across the region. And as I look to the southern half of the continent, where you have those kinds of links already, to create the academic equivalent of the Foro, maybe as an adjunct to something like the Foro, but to identify maybe one person in each university who wants to play. And you don't have to get 20, 30, 40, 50. You need one per school. You can start with a core that has maybe 4 or 5. If you look at what's happening in the United States, the great United States, the movement for transformation that has now propelled Lena Khan to be the imminent chair of the Federal Trade Commission, the group of people who started working on that started with a core of about 4 or 5 people, tops. They didn't start with 50, they started with 4 or 5. And I'd start with that core and to build it and to say, we're going to promote the development of a curriculum. We're going to work with the international organizations and the regional organizations to say, we'll promote the development of courses. We will hold conferences. And by the way, you can hold conferences using this machine, pretty low cost. The hotel expenditures are minimal. So is the travel, minimal. It means you will not get a good pisco sour or caipirinha with it. That doesn't come with the experience, but you can build good networks this way at low cost. So I would think of building new frameworks as a way to do it, and to say this is why it's important. This is why we need them.
Marcelo?
Thank you, Bill.
And I would use Federico. I would use Federico some of these other examples that show how it can be done. That's why the experience in the U.S. is so fascinating now, because in a way the establishment never saw it coming. All of a sudden, whoa, how did this happen? Started small and grew.
Hello, congratulations to ForoCompetencia, to Julian. Hello, Bill. My question points to the, how do you see the role or the contribution of permanent staff in agencies? Because leaders often change, but permanent staff remain in the agency, and has to do, I think, with intellectual infrastructure and regime change that you mentioned before. What's your opinion of the role or contribution of permanent staff, and if in the countries that you mentioned, Chile, Brazil, Mexico, the role of permanent staff has any incidence in the performance of these agencies?
It's vital to their success. And I have a couple of thoughts about that. One is that if I'm new leadership, if I'm coming to the agency, I do not begin by calling them a bunch of idiots. I don't do that. I do not portray myself as a great healer. I say that I'm going to talk to you. I want to learn from you. I need you as part of my effort. And I'm going to recognize your good accomplishments. I'm going to look for those. Second is I am always looking to improve their capabilities. I run good training programs internally to try to lift the level of their human capital. I work as hard as I can to recruit people to come into that staff, even if they're not going to stay there forever. I work very hard to bring them in. With my connection with universities, I want them to be sending me my good junior people. They're good junior people. I want them to send me good interns. But I am always working to build the capacity of that professional staff and to ensure that they can contribute to my program. And by the way, one thing I'm doing as senior management, I am always doing my own internal assessment of how good they are. My dentist, when I see my dentist, often starts by saying, this is going to hurt a little. One thing that hurts a little is to do that kind of assessment, which, by the way, you do for your managers, you do for yourself. You look in the mirror and say, am I as good as I think I am? What do I have to do to get better? But I do continue to do the internal assessment. I try to answer the following question. How many complicated cases do I have good people to run right now? How many difficult mergers can I review right now? Do I have the team, especially the team that's going to play well against the formidable opponents on the other side? How well can I do that? If I'm concerned that my team is not as strong as it has to be, I ask myself, what do I have to do to build that team? What do I have to do to improve them, either by building their skills and abilities inside the house, bringing new people in from outside the house? The short answer to Marcel's question is, how important is the professional permanent staff? If they are not supporting you, if they are not capable of doing the programs you have in mind, it limits what you are able to do. And again, I look back at sport. What is a good coach, a good manager does? How good are my players? That tells you what kind of defense you play. It tells you what kind of offense you're going to play. If your idea of the best play is to have a striker stand 30 meters outside the box and put the ball up in the left-hand corner of the net, that's a good play, by the way. That's a really good play. That's a powerful play. You can only do it if your striker can kick the ball 30 meters on a straight line up into that corner and not outside of it. So who's playing? I have to take account of that all the time. And if there's a way to make my players better, I do that. And I'm always thinking about how I can improve my internal team, the team that's going to be with me over time. And one way I do that is I recognize their accomplishments. I'm always telling them, thank you for doing good things. I don't tell them they're a bunch of idiots.
Great.
If I think they are, I keep that to myself until I learn more.
Ricardo?
Hello, Bill.
Hello, Ricardo.
Nice to see you again.
My pleasure.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. My question is something that is bothering me for a while, and I would like to take this opportunity that we are in front of a major Latin America audience, but with a foreigner, an outsider, as you said, just to help me to think out of the box. We have the dogma from OCDE that cartel is the most important violation for the antitrust rules. But for Latin American countries in which we have economies based in most of the cases in monopolies or oligopolies, wouldn't it be nice to challenge this dogma and try to emphasize the enforcement against unilateral conducts as the digital market, as Esteban was referring to, or even to traditional industries that in our countries are much more concentrated than in the countries that form the major group of the CDE, that maybe cartel is more painful for the economies than abuse of dominance. Wouldn't this be something nice for the next 20 years to review this dogma in Latin America, in your view? Or what do you think?
I think the attitude is being revisited globally. That is, are cartels destructive? Broadly speaking, yes. Do they inflict harm on the economy? Yes. In a context such as bid rigging on public procurement, are they pernicious in denying the dispossessed vital public services that rich people can contract out? Yes. So do we keep cartel enforcement in the mix? Of course. But I think the larger debate that we are seeing globally, certainly in North America, is a debate that says, have we overlooked the harm that comes from unilateral exclusionary behavior, or the behavior, exclusionary conduct that can take place in the context of tight oligopolies, both with respect to single firm conduct and to merger control? Are both of those a matter of concern? I would say if we look where we are today in the mainstream literature and compare it to where we were 10 years ago, we have seen jurisdiction by jurisdiction that debate taking place, and the debate saying you may have overlooked in a harmful way these other dimensions of competition policy and the conditions that give rise to durable positions of dominance, and how merger control can create or reinforce them. So if our Latin agencies were to say we are going to look at these issues in a fresh way, I would not say that they are outliers. I would say they're in a mainstream, because these are the questions being posed universally. This is the big critique of competition policy in the older, better funded jurisdictions, is that you took those issues too lightly. And I would say there's consensus, how to measure consensus. Here I am sitting in my home in Northern Virginia. I don't have a polling process to do this. I don't have a way of measuring consensus. So consensus, that's a term academics throw around ever so casually. I simply notice the number of people I think we would generally respect in our field who said it deserves a lot more attention than we've given it. And if for Latin American agencies to decide we're going to give more attention to it, they're not running off on some odd tangent. They're operating in the mainstream then.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you very much.
Alfonso.
Thank you, and congratulations to ForoCompetencia in its birthday. And Bill, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for being interested for so many years in Latin American competition law, because we know that you pay attention to the whole world. But I can remember that I first met you when we were in Panama in 1996 for the issuance of Law 29, the first Panamanian law. And my question comes immediately after the previous one. You have told us that there is this need to pay attention to the dominance issues and abuse of dominance, and perhaps there has been too much focus in the previous decades in cartels, and now it's time to pay attention to that. My question is if you think that taking into account the developments of the digital world, you consider that there will be a need for reform of the competition laws in order to address these new challenges that the digital age have. And we at the Center for Studies in Competition Law in Colombia, the CEDEC, we have been analyzing these new movements, especially in the United States, where we see probably the most mature with 130 years of antitrust enforcement, and there is talk about reform. We were studying the Kovacic project and wondering if it's necessary, if we have come to a point where it is necessary to make a reform to competition laws. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alfonso. I think within the framework of existing laws, there's some of the modern debate underestimates the flexibility that exists already and how adaptable many of the systems are at present. So I think there's, I've always thought that a strength of our entire field is its adaptability and flexibility within the outline of the laws that most of us work with. So I would start there by asking myself, am I really so confined by the framework that I have? What can I do with the tools that I already have? Which again is a debate that's taking place in a lot of jurisdictions. I think it is very much worth following the discussion that's taking place abroad about what changes are appropriate, especially dealing with digital. But it's striking to me to see the variation in possible solutions and to compare the European approach to the UK approach, the DMA to the DMU. The DMA has a long list of specific prescriptions that seek to deal with large platforms generally. The UK is saying, we're going to focus on large platforms, but we are going to create a bespoke code of conduct for each platform because the platforms are different. And the platforms do not lend themselves to a framework that uses categorical approaches that are applicable to all the platforms. Those are very different approaches to addressing the platforms. And when you look at the US proposals, the proposals in many ways I would consider to be a first draft because the legislative committees have not had the deliberations, the hearings in which they sit down and say, all right, you want to toughen merger control, you want a new set of standards. They haven't had the hearings that bore down in much more detail to discuss exactly what the significance of the specific changes are going to be. That hasn't happened yet. So I want to watch that debate, and especially I want to watch the discussion that takes place around the question of, from the big idea, what are the specific operational criteria that you want to put in place in order to realize that? The US debate has not done that yet, and the legislative debate has not done that yet. It's taken place at a level of abstraction that, you know, when I read these proposals as a former competition agency official, I still ask myself, what do you expect me to do here? That is exactly what it is you want me to do. How do you want me to look at the next merger in light of this framework? And I don't see the level of guidance that I'd like to have from the legislature. And what I'm not particularly fond of is the legislature sketching a big vision with a number of conflicting policy impulses and saying, you figure it out. I would sit back and say, thanks a lot. Thanks. Once again, you have taken a big policy issue. You've defined a big problem. You've given me some hazy guidance about what to do, but you've said, you figure it out. I want them to spend more time wrestling with that. So do I want to follow this debate? Yes. Is my mind open to things that I might have to change? Absolutely. Do I want to see how these grand older jurisdictions with a lot more money specify what they're going to do? Oh, yes. Before I go and do it myself. If this were the pharmaceutical sector, I'd like to see how these drug trials work out. I want to see more evidence about the trials before I start administering the treatment myself.
Of course.
But I am interested in the trials very much.
Thank you, Bill.
Eduardo?
Thank you very much, Bill, for,
hello, Eduardo.
Your thoughts. How are you? And thank you, Julian, for all the efforts that you have been putting in this forum for so many years. So, Bill, I would like to touch on some of the questions that were raised already, basically from Esteban, Alfonso, and You know, I think we have been experiencing in the last few years one of the most intensive, let's say, benefits from markets. Globalization has been growing incredibly, and the digital economy has been one of the most important factors for that. On the other side, at the same time, we have a major criticism on market-oriented policies coming from different governments, from the right, from the left. I mean, what you just experienced in the US is, I think, is a good example. What we are facing in Mexico and in many Latin American countries represent other examples. And the paradox is that we have receiving benefits from markets at the same time and criticism from the political major players from different countries. So my question is, if we have to think about, I mean, from many of the questions on the challenges that are coming from the digital economy now, I think the coordination among different agencies in the world is more important than in any other moment before. And my question is if we should think about a different design of international organizations that represent competition authorities, specifically ICN, the ICN. The ICN is actually this year is going to have 20 years, and my impression is that this is a good moment to think about what should be the future of the ICN. You were using just the example of Andreas Munt of the yesterday's conference, talking about the speed that we have to, in which we have to move forward. But I think your question is quite right. I mean, where are we going? And if that speed is, if all agencies should follow the same speed at the same time, I mean, if we could coordinate in such a way that we are not going to generate major distortions in the global markets. Thank you very much, Bill.
Yeah, I'm a great admirer of what these international organizations have done and how they have adapted in the last 20 years alone. How I think all of them have become, to my pleasure, much more focused on policy implementation, have been much more focused on the demands of clients. I think they've done remarkable adaptability by creating regional focal points instead of bringing everybody together in a giant room. You know, the difficulties. One, it is difficult in the context of a very large organization to address distinctive regional or national needs. And that's why I think developing an alternative, it's a complement to, not a substitute for, but a complement is the development of regional alliances, regional hubs that focus on the conversation on a regional basis. And many of the people in our session today have played a role in trying to create that, to foster the development of the discussion. You know, why does it make so much sense? The political science of our countries and our regions, of course, varies. And we should be involved in a more intense discussion among countries that are similarly situated in that respect. So that conversation should be regional, should be more localized, not to the exclusion of the larger international networks, but as a supplement to it. And I think many of those relationships have developed in the Latin American context. And I think not just as a formal, not just because of a formal need, but you know each other better than I do. And unless you've been fooling me for decades, I actually see a sense of personal commitment, common cause among current and former leaders in the Latin environment in many ways. To put it in another way, I think a number of you actually like each other as persons and do not simply respect each other as professionals. And I think that community has developed over time. That's a tremendous asset. You can't measure it, but it's an asset that can be used to create this more intense regional collaboration that I see to be a crucial adjunct, more and more important adjunct to the larger international network. So I think among the things that the larger international organizations can think about, and you're right, October is 20 years for ICN. Recognizing this need, how do we promote the development of this additional form of collaboration? How do we use the bigger international platform to do that? To ensure that our own efforts to deliver good results are maximized? And how do we marshal the global resources in a way that address the specific issues that we've been talking about? The fact of great speed, the need to build knowledge and apply knowledge quickly and effectively, to have a genuine debate about what we're learning and what the solutions are, which again requires better established authorities to be more direct and candid about the political dimension. I can remember watching a program in which at one of the large international groups where a relatively new authority asked someone from an established authority, how do you deal with political pressure? And the answer was, oh, political pressure. We don't have political pressure. We are so evolved, so advanced that that's not a problem. That was a dishonest answer. The honest answer was political pressure is omnipresent. It's like asking, is there flour in bread? Almost always. And talking about not whether there's the pressure, but how you deal with that larger environment. So in part, the conversation has to address these kinds of issues honestly too. But I see the regional focus being a very important adjunct to what the larger international organizations have done, and the creation of networks using ideas that the Foro has developed. Again, to bring it back to the Foro, nothing compelled the Foro to come into being. It started small. It linked a number of different groups together in a continuing conversation. That's a nice model for thinking about what you might do on a larger scale throughout the region.
Great. Mario.
Thank you, Julian. Good morning, Bill. Good morning, everyone.
Hello, Mario.
Good to see you. Good to see so many friends here at the ForoCompetencia. I want to congratulate Julian and all of our friends in Argentina, because this ForoCompetencia is truly one of the stars in our constellation here in the region. And I would say that the one of the unintended consequences of the pandemic has been the real extension of the forum to a regional dimension, which we have now, which is great. And I hope even if we return to our daily lives in a more normal way, I hope that this forum remains virtual as well, because it does give us this opportunity like the one that we're having today. So congratulations for this. And my question to Bill has to do perhaps in a selfish way from the point of view of what I do every day, or I try to do, which is how do we support better the different jurisdictions in our region to improve their performance. And so in your opinion, Bill, what do multilaterals like the IDB can do better to support these efforts, aside from just giving resources?
Yeah, Mario, it's a wonderful perennial question, and I underscore your initial comment that what this larger healthcare scourge has taught us in the last year and a half is that this mechanism can be used as a device to promote interaction and learning. That's an important lesson to take away. I think among the best investments that the donor institutions, the international organizations can make is this continuing investment in improving implementation. That is, in working with agencies to discuss how to do this work. Imagine I've learned an enormous amount talking to former officials, asking them about their work. Imagine initiatives that make that kind of knowledge readily accessible and develop that knowledge in the region. To encourage the distillation of knowledge about leadership. And by the way, it's rich knowledge. I don't have to patronize you to tell you that the region has exceptional talent and has had remarkable talent, not just in the agencies, but it's throughout the bar. In many instances, it's represented in academia. The region does not have to apologize to anybody when we look at the human capital that's been brought to bear on the field. It's there. So how do we take that human capital and make the lessons it has absorbed more readily available throughout the region? How do we promote, for example, the development of better data collection and analysis? How do we focus on developing this intellectual academic infrastructure to build partnerships, what Ellen Fells used to call co-producers, who can support the operation of individual agencies? How do we think of solving the problem, Mario, that we've just posed a couple of times, which is digital issues, very complex, demanding conceptually? How do we promote and devise a way for agencies in the region collectively to pool their efforts, to do common studies, which is something that European agencies have done well? Imagine a study that joins two jurisdictions together in mapping out what's happening in their part of the continent and studying that, to fund that, to promote that. How, in other words, to use the resources to build that infrastructure which will support the entire region. Those kinds of investments. Taking success stories, building case studies in the way that a Kennedy School might do or the ANZOG would do, and say, here are projects that our agencies have run. This is what went well. This is what could have been better. Case studies that get taught again and again about leadership, policy development, and success. And to go back to our earlier conversation about professional staff, make these available. This is how it can be done. This is what worked. I think those are good investments. And in many ways, Mario, when I look at what IDB, others have done, of course they've done some of this already. Of course they have. This is not new to them. But I think the extension of it is valuable in the region.
Marcelo.
Thank you, Julian, and congratulations to ForoCompetencia. Just to start, this is a fantastic achievement, 20 years in terms of stability of being such an important player in the region. And Bill, it's always such a pleasure to talk to you and to hear you.
Marcelo, it is great
like
to see and hear you, and I can't help but think back to first meetings in Brasilia when you were at CAGE.
Over 20 years ago, and
Only
you've always
yesterday.
been a serious partner in terms of helping us build better. But one concern that I have, and one point that you mentioned, I think is particularly important today, is that you talked about taking nothing for granted. And you've always talked about life cycles and how sometimes you may seem like you're growing and going in good directions, and suddenly things can be reversed. And I think in the region that is a very concrete fear, and certainly one that I have right now, especially in the context of very significant political shifts going on and governments going to either extreme, and the tendency to act like you just described before, of disparaging everything that your predecessor did and trying to change everything and say that everything was wrong because all the discussion is so polarized that risk increases. And I just wanted to hear a bit more in terms of what you can do to safeguard from that. I mean, obviously having a permanent staff is something. You talk about relationship with other stakeholders is trying to improve your sort of anchors and try to be more stable. But also I think one thing you mentioned about the CMA that I've always admired also from the OFG time was being able to assess your results and show people what you can do, what you're providing to society as elements that can help you weather storms from changes in government who are sort of fierce adversaries and are trying to outdo or undo everything the others have changed. We see and feel that even in maybe relatively more stable systems like in Brazil, sometimes that is still a fear. So I don't think we're out of the risk of these life cycles, and that has to be a concern, eternal vigilance to be able to maintain those gains.
It's a frightfully hard issue, and again, the issue that Marcelo raises, I think, is universal in so many ways. That is, these are questions that are being posed with tremendous urgency in so many different jurisdictions, and the suggestions that I have in response are not necessarily going to be effective. That is, I recognize the possibility that the storms that you describe, the forces that can emerge, can topple these systems and can turn them upside down and channel them in directions that might be fundamentally destructive. So my suggestion is my suggestions are not necessarily effective. Just as I think we continue to live with the residue of the global financial crisis over a decade ago. It shook the foundations of our economies. In the United States, it discredited, in some ways, capitalism itself. It raised fundamental doubts about the efficacy of government regulation and about the regulators and the regulated, and we're still paying for that. So how do you sustain a sense of value in market processes and in competition policy in the face of that? I think you touched upon one of the most effective ways. This is where it is crucial for agencies to be able to draw upon what in a loose way might be called economic precedents. That is to say, why is the framework we have tried to develop worthwhile? Let me show you. Not by abstract calls for respect for competition, but tangible, visible, understandable examples about how it's made a difference. How it's better now than it was before because of what we've done. And that requires the ability to draw upon examples from our experience. And you can only draw upon them if you've developed them. You need case studies. You need some data that says this is how the economy has improved because of adjustments we've made. Look at Australia, look at how skillfully, look at how much Australian policymakers have drawn upon the lessons of Fred Hilmer's transformative study in the 1990s, where he said, this is how much poorer we are as Australians because of the bottlenecks to competition. And this is how we can improve them, and how Australia has documented significant improvements as a consequence of it. We need those kinds of examples. Some of them very humble, some of them more elaborate, but to show our work, to say, this is how what we've done has made things better. Now, can a nation decide, we don't care, or we're not persuaded? Of course they can. I would like to at least have the opportunity to put them in front of the larger nation and say, before you walk away from this policymaking endeavor, I want you to at least have some idea of what you're giving up. So please take this into account first. That's one step. I think another is that perhaps we need to invest more effort in looking out over the horizon and seeing how the weather is going to change, and involving those who want to effectuate basic change in the larger conversation about what's going on. If I have to look at a blind spot in my own experience, and of course, I never make a mistake. I know I will someday, and it will be upsetting, and it will be tough to live with. But when I look at my own experience and blind spots, that is, what might I have anticipated? I'm not sure that we took seriously enough in the United States the critique that was emerging. We dismissed it as being simply a fringe voice. And I think we all know in life what happens when you do not take arguments on their own terms and to wrestle with them in a serious way. So were we involving them in the conversation broadly enough? Or were we filtering to bring in people who believed what we did and we talked to each other too much? So does an agency engage in conscious efforts to go beyond its walls and to listen to voices that are criticizing fundamental assumptions that have guided the system? That is a question of convening events, of talking to this intellectual infrastructure on the outside, but not simply responding to the storm with examples that say, this is why what we have been doing is valuable and worth keeping as part of the policy mix. But also, before the storm occurs, to have our meteorologists out on the frontier asking what's changing and why is it changing? And what are the arguments that are calling in question what we do? What are the underlying political sources of political turmoil? And how does that relate to what we do? And how are we able to explain that what we do plays a role in addressing those underlying sources of discontent? So when I look at my own experience and criticize it, I don't know that we worked hard enough in my agency to do that. And I'm not sure that we have worked hard enough in developing the precedents, the case studies that say, this is why pro-competitive policies make a positive difference for the economy and why you should take them into account. So from both directions, anticipation and the invocation of specific examples of how it worked effectively in the past. Are those things together enough to sustain a system? I don't know. I recognize the possibility that the external shock might be so severe that it topples the whole thing, which is the very humbling aspect of what we do.
Bill, do you have time for the last two questions?
Absolutely. I'm not watching a clock. I have a clock in front of me, but I'm not watching it.
Gustavo. You're muted. You're on mute. Gustavo. No se escucha.
Ahí está. Okay, I'm sorry.
Hello, Gustavo.
Nice to meet you, Bill. First of all, congratulations to ForoCompetencia, and thank you very much for the invitation and giving us a chance to be here and being part of the Foro. I just didn't want to leave the opportunity to say hello to Bill and to tell him that here in Paraguay, among our staff, you have a couple of fans, and myself, one of them. You are some sort of a rock star for us here. We have learned a lot. We have learned a lot from your work, from the work you have been developing through the years. CONACOM, which is a competition agency in Paraguay, is about to become 6 years old this year. And can I ask you for a couple of words or suggestions for such a new agency as the Paraguayan one?
Gustavo, it's great to see you, and I have the greatest admiration for people who are trying to do startups. You are part of a startup, and startups in any field are hard to establish. I guess I would say one is I mentioned again that in looking at my colleagues and looking at the larger political environment, I would say please have realistic expectations about what we're doing here and what we can accomplish. We're going to try our best to do a lot. That's our job. But recognize the constraints that we face. That's a hard message to convey, but I want my political overseers and the larger society to understand that I am doing my best to use what I have, but this is a gradual process, and it's going to take a bit of time. Another is that the best teachers I would have in the region are all of those wonderful agencies right in your neighborhood.
Thank
and you know these people, but
of course,
as my case studies, I would study Argentina so carefully. I would study Brazil, of course. I would study Chile. I would study Peru, just to take those that are more or less closest in the neighborhood. And I'd look at others and I'd say, how did they do it? How did they build? And I would spend a lot of my time talking to them. I would talk to a lot of the people on this screen, and because they are generous and constructive individuals and they know a lot, they will share what they know with you about how to do it. I would go to school on that experience because it is a very good schoolhouse with very good instructors. And it's all at home. It's all at home. I mean, the exciting thing about the continent is that there are so many positive stories about what has been accomplished and can be measured against any other continent, any other set of regimes. So it's all right there.
Diego.
Right.
Thank you, Julian, and congratulations.
Hello, Diego.
Hello, Bill. Nice to see you again. Thank you for sharing your huge experience and excellent presentations. Regarding agency and courts conversations, what do you think about past officials of an agency become a judge of a court? I must tell you that I am participating in a process in this direction, so I would like to hear your comments.
I think the global experience has been a good transition. It's been a good transition to have individuals who have some direct experience with the agency, maybe at a senior leadership level, moving on to the tribunal. Of course, the concern that an outsider, and if I were a private counselor to a private interest, I would say, oh, that's wonderful. Now I have the referee now used to play for the other team. And although the referee is now wearing the black jersey, I somehow see, if you pulled the jersey back, you'd see the jersey of the old team, and that would unsettle me. I think the experience in most jurisdictions has been that the referee now treats the role of the referee as being the paramount role. But they do it with an understanding of the constraints that confront the agency and an understanding of the larger objectives of the system. A good topic for a good panel someday will be the relationship between the overseeing tribunal and the competition agency. That would be a difficult one to have because it is such a sensitive topic. You would probably have to have that in a small gathering after a suitable number of adult drinks as a precursor to having the conversation. It's a hard conversation to have. But in many jurisdictions, there's been a real tension for a variety of reasons. And I think there is not a complete understanding on both sides of the conversation about the circumstances that confront each institution. One way to bridge that gap is to have people go from the authority to the tribunal. And I think often in the tribunal, the person going from the authority does not go with an unmixed view, with a completely unmixed view of their former home. They know the weaknesses. They know the flaws. They know the analytical gaps. So they're not inclined to be credulous observers of what the agency does. They can be critical, but I would say a mix of critical and sympathetic at the same time. And I think that that's what can be brought to the process. And by the way, if I were the ICN, if I were shaping the research agenda for the international organizations, this is a research topic I would promote. What has been the experience of specialist tribunals that oversee competition authorities? Are you better off having a specialist tribunal or going into the general courts? And not just a rough impression, again, impressionism, but a more detailed examination of what's happened when you have one or the other. That's a big, important topic about engineering. Really important topic.
Your final words.
I'm going to join the chorus of those who congratulate you, Julian. You are too modest and humble to do it on your own. And because you won't do it, I'll do it for you. I think that what you and your colleagues have accomplished through Foro is a great example of a lesser known ingredient of an effective system. To have adults having a conversation about what is important in a constructive environment, an environment that emphasizes learning, an effort to transmit what people have learned and to bring it to bear on policy issues in a constructive way. So that when the story ultimately is written about the development of competition policy in Latin America, it will feature chapters on a number of formative figures. But one chapter will deal with the Foro, because the Foro showed a path about how to build the understandings, knowledge, to test ideas in a way that generate better policy. And that is a remarkable accomplishment. I suppose the only people who think it would be easy have never tried to do it. There are many more challenges to face, but I add my enthusiastic praise and admiration for what you have done. And I look forward to 20 more good years so that the 40th is at least as good as the 20th was.
Well, thank you, Bill. Thank you very much for your generosity. I think that the success of ForoCompetencia is a result of teamwork and of the generosity and participation of all of you. So I'm getting too much credit for something that is a collective work.
If you lived in Washington, Julian, you would seize all of the credit, all of it. I know you have a lot to learn. In Washington, you take all of the credit, and if things didn't go well, it is the disappointing performance of others.
Great. I think, thank you, Bill, very much. I thank everyone for participating. It has been a great way to celebrate ForoCompetencia's 20th anniversary. I couldn't think of a better way. So thank you very much, everyone, and I hope to see you next month.
See you next time.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Bye. Thank you.
Gracias.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. I'm most grateful.